So I think I'm just going to start with some basic intros, so we can kind of, people can know who we are. My name's Craig. I write the Sparrow Wallet, which is a desktop Bitcoin wallet with a focus on usability and privacy. And I've been doing that for a number of different years, years now. I've just met Josi, who I've been looking forward to meet for a long time. So maybe just.
Yeah, I'm Josi. I work on Bitcoin Core. I primarily work on the wallet. That's where I spend a lot of time getting started. I work on like privacy and usability things. I'm also a Sparrow user, so I was quite excited to meet Craig. And like often happens in the space, you interact with people for a couple of years, sometimes online, before you actually get to meet in person. So yeah, I think we both kind of come at Bitcoin with a similar interest of like privacy, usability. So I think that's kind of what we'll be spending the topic on today. Privacy in general, and like specifically practical wallet privacy.
Yeah, so this is adopting Bitcoin. So I think I chose this topic because we need to really look at how practical a lot of these technologies that get invented are, and can they be practically used by the people out there. And that's kind of what I'm always thinking about when I'm working on Sparrows. I'm trying to think like, is this a practical thing? Are people actually going to use it? And that's kind of one of the filters that I have when somebody suggests maybe Sparrow should have something in it. So I think where I'd like to start today, we've got Josi here. Josi is the co-author of the Silent Payments spec, which is a similar spec to something previously in place called BIP47. And what it involves is putting a static piece of information out there, whether it's called a payment code or a silent payments address. Those are the two different kinds of things. And that basically allows somebody to send you money in a private way and in a non-interactive way. So you don't have to give them an address. And if they send you money, no one else can see that money has been received. So that's basically what that kind of technology solves. So these two technologies do it in slightly different ways with some different trade-offs. And I thought it would be fun today to kind of compare these two trade-offs and just chat about these things against the lens of what technologies get used and how do we ensure that they do actually get used, because we can invent all kinds of things, but without usage it's not very useful. So I think maybe where we should start here is to say, I put BIP47, which was the kind of precursor, into Sparrow because at the time it was the only one out there, and it was relatively easy for me to build in a way that I think it's got a downside. One of these downsides is that you have to send this notification transaction before you can create this link. So what we are doing with these non-interactive payment schemes is we are allowing people to exchange information, to individuals to exchange information, and based on that information, you can then create these wallets in effect, or you can create addresses that only these two individuals know about. And that is the basis of how BIP47 works. The question is, how do you share this information? And that's where silent payments differs. So silent payments is better in some respects in that it is more private. The way in which it works is that you actually encode that information into the transaction. And that's an interesting approach, but it's also got a downside in that you need to scan the blockchain. So I don't know if I've done a fair job there of kind of giving a basic intro, but my kind of question is, well, Josi, how do you see that trade-off? Do you see silent payments as strictly an upgrade to BIP47? Do you see it as a trade-off for certain kinds of users? What's your kind of way that you view these two side by side?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. But before I answer the question, I think I want to take one step back and just make it very clear what we're talking about when we say payment codes. So when you use Bitcoin, the first thing you do is you ask someone like, hey, send me an address. And they can text it to you over maybe an insecure medium like SMS or something. And now whoever's reading your SMS messages now knows this address and it's associated with your identity. Or you maybe post it on Twitter and say like, hey, send money to this. And now everybody in the world who can see that address can kind of see everything that's going on there. Now to use Bitcoin privately, it's like one of the first things that's mentioned in the white paper, and like probably one of the only parts of the white paper that really talks about privacy, where they say you have to use a fresh address every single time. Now we've all used other payment apps like Venmo, PayPal, whatever, and this is just not a good user experience. Of every time I want to send you money, I've got to get a hold of you, and ideally I have to get a hold of you in a private way or a secure way so we can exchange this address, this one-time thing. So naturally what we see is everyone just tends to reusing those addresses. And now you're just kind of shouting to the world like, here's everybody who sent me money, here's how much they've sent me, here's when I spend it, etc. And this is like quite a downgrade over what we're used to in other payment apps where there is kind of this privacy, and also there's this usability of like usernames. So I think the motivation for Bit47, Silent Payments, LNURL, like Bolt 12, is trying to move towards this user experience that we're used to in other payment apps of like, just give me information one time or allow me to discover it without interacting with you. And now I have like a username. And that username in the form of Bit47 is the payment code. In Silent Payments, it's a silent payment address. In Bolt 12, it's a bigger one. And now with BIP353, we can actually put human readable names on top of them. So we're getting close there. And I think long term, I would love to where the BIP47 versus silent payments discussion is just among the developers. And the users are like, here's my Bitcoin username. And they don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. So then to dig down into the comparison between the two, so like Craig mentioned, BIP47 was kind of the leader. It was based on this earlier idea called stealth addresses, which came out in like 2013, I think, was a proposal that never really got any traction. And then it actually had some significant downsides where in stealth addresses, you were encoding extra data into every transaction, I think in an op return, which then made the transaction more expensive than if you just did the non-private thing of reusing an address. So now there's kind of this pressure of like, yeah, I could use the more private thing, but I have to pay more. That seems silly. So I think BIP47 correctly identified that as a problem, and then they came up with this idea of the notification transaction, which the analogy I use there, it's actually more of a payment channel. Right, you say I set up this one-time op return, or there's multiple ways to do it, but there's this one-time on-chain thing, which is a secure channel for the sender and the recipient to exchange instructions on how to derive new addresses in the future. And the idea is, well, we pay this on-chain cost one time, and then it's amortized over the life of that relationship to where every subsequent transaction now only costs as much as a regular Bitcoin transaction. And I think that worked quite well. One of the things, you mentioned silent payments is more private. One of the things I never liked about Bit47 was there was this two-way exchange where, I get your payment code and I set up a payment channel with you, and it also encodes my payment code so that you could send back to me. And in some cases, that's really nice if I am fine with you knowing my identity. But if I have my payment code posted on my Twitter, and then I want to anonymously send you some money, and then now you have this payment code that you can link back to my Twitter, and you're like, oh, Josie just sent me some money. And then, somebody comes and hacks Craig's wallet, and they take it, and now they know everything that I'm doing, my business relationship with Craig. That, to me, was a downside, which got me more interested in looking at other ways of doing this. And then I heard Ruben Thompson talking about silent payments and kind of became obsessed with it. And so if we remember, stealth addresses, op return in every transaction. Then we've got Bit47, one on-chain op return, and then silent payments, no on-chain anything. So it's kind of this movement towards how can we put less and less data on-chain. And I think in terms of usability or like adoption, I think the theory of Bitcoin is on-chain space is going to be rising in cost. Like that's kind of built into the security model of Bitcoin. We expect that the on-chain fees are going to continue to rise. So I see this, trade-off more as we want to keep optimizing as few bytes on-chain and then push that cost somewhere else. So in the silent payments case, the transaction itself, it reuses public keys in the transaction that are already there to kind of communicate this information between sender and receiver. And now instead of being a payment channel, it's really on a per transaction basis. So if Craig has a silent payment address and I send to him, on the first of the month, and I want to anonymously support Sparrow, I send the first transaction. Then in the next month, I send the second transaction. Craig has no idea it's me, and he has no idea that these two separate transactions came from the same entity. So that sounds really nice, right, from privacy. What's the downside? Craig has to check all the transactions that might be silent payments, whereas in BIP47, it's more there's this one-time channel, and then he still has to check transactions, but more in the traditional way that we do in Bitcoin of like monitoring for addresses. So in silent payments, instead of using on-chain space to minimize the scanning cost, which is what BIP47 was doing, we're now pushing the cost computationally. You have to scan more and do more work at the benefit of saving an on-chain cost. So I think that benefit today is maybe not fully realized because on-chain fees are perhaps scarily low, depending on how you view things. But I think it'll start to make more sense as that on-chain cost goes up. And then also the privacy aspect of it. Like, do you want to use this thing for a more private use case versus one where it's presumed that the sender and recipient are fine knowing some things about each other? And then, in terms of like how people are practically going to use it, I think my hope is that we've traded this like on-chain savings for an engineering complexity. And so when we start thinking about mobile clients, I think BIP47 did see more adoption because it fit more into this Electrum model where you get a group of addresses and you scan for them. And that works pretty well for mobile. If we have time, I think maybe we can talk about the privacy trade-offs. But now in this world where you are scanning for the transactions themselves, mobile becomes very difficult. And the easy answer is like everyone should just run a node. And that's just sometimes like, I think we should always keep that as the ideal of like the most private experience you're going to have in Bitcoin is if you run your own node. And not only privacy, but usability. You're going to get all these features like notifications of transactions in the mempool, which is very difficult to do on mobile. However, I don't think that's really a fair bar to just be like, well, run your own node or you don't get these nice benefits. But I do think we have to like make sure that that's always an option that we're presenting to people and then explaining the trade-offs of like something like silent payments. It does work in a mobile environment, but your bandwidth usage is going to go up. And maybe there's going to be some slowness and you're not going to see those mempool notifications and things like that. So really, I do think it comes down to future-proofing, but also trade-offs of like, how do you expect to use this technology? Are you more concerned about privacy or are you more concerned about this traditional payments app experience? I'll pause there and maybe we can.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a very fair presentation of the two sides of it. I think, just to dig in a little bit more into the kind of, because I kind of want to focus in on what are the technologies that people are likely to use. Now, as I understand it, and maybe this is a little segue where we kind of jump into how wallets work and what kind of wallet technologies under the hood are the ones that are more likely to get used. From what I understand, because silent payments has this blockchain scanning requirement, the compact block filters or BIP158 technology is kind of required for the light client option. In other words, if you're not running your own node, you have to use this particular approach. Now, the technology behind it is very cool. Unfortunately, it's still quite resource heavy. As far as I know, and I'm probably wrong here, so when I say this, I know someone's going to say, "Well, you didn't mention X." But as far as I know, Wasabi Wallet is the only wallet to have actually integrated BIP158. Obviously, it's built into Bitcoin Core, and it's quite useful there just to increase the scanning time if you have wallets in Bitcoin Core. So that's useful in and of itself. But in terms of a sort of a wallet outside of Bitcoin Core, I actually tried to use this yesterday, and my experience was I fired up an empty wallet. It downloaded 5.5 gigs. It took an hour and 10 minutes, and my CPU was running pretty hot for most of that time. So, my concern with any payments technology is it going to get used? Because you need senders and receivers in order for it to become useful. And my worry, and when people come to me and they say, well, what about silent payments? My concern is that if we don't see adoption, because the technology is too hard to use, then, I don't want to have to support things that, I'm going to have to maintain for many, many years if very few people are using them. Now, BIP47 is relatively niche. That's the reality. Is I think the non-interactive private payments world is a relatively niche world to begin with. My concern is that silent payments is even more niche within that. So that's kind of my argument against it, if you will. And I really actually am curious to hear how you think about that, and because it's a direct question to me today as a wallet dev: is do I build this thing in, or do I try to, or not?
Yeah, I think you're really good to call out the developer costs of, there's a lot of buzzwords that go around in the Bitcoin space, and people will hear something and then attach their personality to it and be like, I want feature X, and you dig in a little more and you find out they don't actually run a node, or they don't even use Bitcoin for payments. And there's a real cost for these projects like yours, where, as I understand it, you're an individual developer with limited time, and you want to provide the best experience to your users. So every new feature that you add, there's a real cost over the lifetime of your software project. And we deal with this a lot in Bitcoin Core as well. People will be like, we want feature X in Bitcoin Core. And we're thinking, all right, what percentage of users are actually going to use that when they download Bitcoin Core? Because we're a very limited team, and we want to make sure that we can guarantee a certain level of security and quality. So I think this is very pertinent to kind of start the discussion from, are people going to use it? And are people going to be able to use it? And I think I tend to I don't really like the private payments moniker, and I usually talk more about usernames, because I think static payment codes, that whole category of like Bolt 12, LNURL, silent payments, BIP47, I think that's the user experience we need to move towards for adoption. This kind of song and dance that we do, exchanging Bolt 11 invoices interactively, addresses interactively. I think this is actually the thing that is going to hurt adoption with people who are coming into Bitcoin now and in the future, because they're coming from a world where they expect this kind of non-interactive username experience, and to date we really haven't been able to offer that in Bitcoin. And I've seen people use a Bolt 12 wallet for the first time and be able to use it with a username, and it's like a transformative experience. They're like, wow, this is actually cool and it works. And so my interest is, how can we provide that experience for users? Because I think that is something users want and will use. And how can we do it in a way that doesn't compromise some of the ideals of Bitcoin, like privacy and custody, self-custody. And so starting from there, then it's a question of, all right, so we kind of agree there's this product market of username experiences. Now, how do we do that in a feasible way? So BIP158 was kind of designed not with mobile in mind at first. It was kind of pioneered by the Lightning Labs team. It's called the Neutrino protocol, and it was for people who were running Lightning nodes on servers and didn't really want or need the entire blockchain. So there was still this expectation that it was kind of like a production kind of environment, and it was so you could build these lightweight Lightning nodes. And then some other people were like, oh, well, we could also do this for mobile. And I don't think it's a good fit for mobile. And which is, you mentioned Usability Wallet, which is still kind of a desktop wallet. So desktop wallets and Neutrino, I think, can fit well together. So when we were first discussing silent payments, that was kind of, we wanted to look for ways to not reinvent the wheel. And when we first started it, Ruben and I were like, we're kind of going to ask all these wallets to rewrite their backends, and that's for all these solo projects or passion projects, that's kind of a non-starter. So we're like, all right, well, we'll start with something that people know and maybe there's libraries for, which is BIP158. And I think it's a good start, but a few issues there is, Silent payments doesn't actually have a blockchain scanning requirement. It's more of a UTXO scanning requirement. And if people have used Monero wallets, they'll know that in the light client world with Monero, you leave the phone off for a month and then you turn it on and it has to catch up all of the blocks. No notion of a UTXO set there. And BIP 158 kind of has this same concept of like if you leave your phone off for a month, you have to catch up with all the blocks. And for me, this is like a non-starter, right? Because then your user experience degrades linearly with time. And unless you're like checking the wallet and using the wallet every single day, you kind of have this catch-up requirement, which is quite bad. So I think I consider BIP 158 not as like a necessary backend for silent payments, but more as this let's get the conversation going and let's get some buy-in. But ideally, what we want is a UTXO model where your phone is offline for a month, it comes back online. You don't care about any transaction that was created and spent in your absence. You just want to come back in and be like, hey, what's the current state of the UTXO set? Send me all the transactions I haven't seen yet so I can check if they're mine. And so this is actually more similar to what Cake Wallet is doing because they've implemented sending and receiving for silent payments where the phone is offline for a while, comes back on, tells the server, hey, this was the last block that I scanned. Give me all of the UTXOs that are still unspent that were created in the meantime. And instead of using like a compact filter, they just actually send all of the information for the UTXO. So again, it's more bandwidth intensive, which makes the scanning a bit not great when you're on like a flaky mobile connection. But I think that's the direction we want to go. And what was nice about that, they were able to add this extra index to an Electrum server. So they're already using Electrum to power their wallet. We added another endpoint, and it was, in terms of developer hours, not too bad. The experience, like that's the wallet I use on the payments now. It's not great, but I see that more as an engineering problem rather than like a protocol problem. Like in theory, that protocol is quite nice. And now we just need to like put our engineering hats on and be like, all right, how can we make this encode compact? How can we be more bandwidth efficient? How can we make this a more seamless experience? And where I'm optimistic is we use other apps on our phone, like Instagram or Twitter or some of these other things, and these are like very bandwidth intensive apps that are doing quite a lot of bandwidth in the background. They just have brilliant engineers optimizing that problem. So that's kind of where I want to spend my time thinking about like, all right, let's identify a good model, like a UTXO scanning model, where there is, it's really like a constant scanning time, right? Like the longer you leave your phone off in between a scan, the cost of checking for new payments is really like constant time in terms of how long does it take me to scan a UTXO set. Then we figure out, all right, that's a good theoretic model. Let's engineer it and make sure that we're kind of killing that problem like really, really well. I also think as we've started to talk more about privacy and mobile, I think people are understanding the way the world is moving is nobody's really using desktops or even laptops anymore. Your compute life happens on your phone. And so we're looking at these protocols like BIP 158 and being like, that wasn't really designed for a phone. So how can we kind of reimagine it? And that's an area that I've been spending some time working with some other engineers and like Bitcoin protocol devs to say like, how can we learn from the mistakes of BIP 158 for the mobile problem and start to imagine a protocol that would work better for mobile. And I think that's interesting to me because it benefits, my personal interest, silent payments, but I think it would also be a benefit to other wallet protocols where we're starting to say like, hey, like we can't expect that a user is going to be running a desktop or a laptop. And a lot of people are going to be using their phone for everything. And I think that's where we need to start spending more time and thinking about those things. So one I guess positive step there was a developer recently who took the Nakamoto library. It was Nakamoto was a full implementation of BIP 158 in Rust, kind of designed for this privacy-minded thing. And so we started to use that for a wallet that I've been working on with a few other people called Donna Wallet as a silent payments wallet. And we very quickly realized, okay, Nakamoto was built for a desktop. It doesn't work with this mobile environment. Like you can't just have a constantly running event loop on a phone, especially if it's on an iPhone. So this other dev independently was wanting to build like a more privacy-focused wallet, and we got in contact with him, and he was rewriting the Nakamoto crate, still doing BIP 158, but with a mobile environment mind and figuring out how to optimize for that. And that's now, I think, called Kyoto, and that's going to be eventually moved into BDK, which is a wallet developer library. So I look for signals like that, like where are people kind of running into the same problems that I'm running into, and how can we kind of join forces there? Eventually, I'd like to see a new protocol for mobile environments, kind of taking inspiration from Electrum, BIP 158, and a few others to say, okay, now how can we take the last 5 to 6 years of learning and move towards something that's actually designed for mobile, for privacy, works for something like silent payments, works for these other protocols. And I think that's kind of what's happening naturally, which is why I'm kind of maybe more positive on the, I don't think that the engineering problems are a stopper for something like silent payments.
Yeah, I think that, again, I would like to believe that that's going to happen, and that's certainly what I'll be looking out for. I think just to kind of talk more generally about how I see the kind of the kind of tech, and in particular how the wallet fetches information. I think if there exists a solution that does the job efficiently, in the sense that it's near instant, that the bandwidth usage is low, particular implementation is going to get used versus an implementation which does a poorer job. That's just how people will experience it. Whether we like it or not, privacy is a secondary concern, or maybe a tertiary concern. Maybe, the first concern is, does the thing work? And by work, does it work in the first 10 seconds, right? Because that's what people have come to expect. The second concern is are my funds on this device secure? The third concern, or maybe even lower, is, are they private? So trying to rearrange the order of that as devs is usually not a successful approach. Usually you have to kind of deal with it in that order. That's one of the reasons that Sparrow uses the Electrum wallet approach. And I would argue that there's at least a strong argument to be made that the Electrum devs who released their wallet back in 2010, believe it or not, which is quite amazing if you think about it. Bitcoin released in 2009, so really like early days. They gave the world this address index, and Bitcoin Core, for maybe good reasons, maybe bad reasons, decided not to build an address index into Bitcoin Core. Personally, there are pros and cons to that call, of course, and I don't think anyone can ever know which was the correct choice. I would probably these days side on saying I don't think it was the correct choice, because it's kind of outsourced such a critical part of how Bitcoin works for most wallets in the world today to a entity which is relatively loose and not kind of as well managed, not as many devs as Bitcoin Core. So maybe we do get a upgrade to that particular address index, but I would argue that it's always like the address index has largely won the war. It's unlikely the wallets are going to be like, let's use a technology which is slower, which uses more bandwidth. It's a very difficult call for a dev to make. And I don't think a lot of devs will make that call. And that's why we're seeing all the new wallets like the Nunchucks and the Bitcoin Keepers. They all just go straight to that, because it's what users want. They want it to be fast. They want it to be low bandwidth. They want it to appear instant. So that's kind of my view on it, and not just speaking to you, but to the sort of broader audiences. Any payments technology that reality is going to struggle to get adoption, because you're just really up against those very hard truths, those kind of order of priorities of what users want. And that's been my challenge in trying to, I go through the silent payment spec. I did it a few months ago. I did it again this week, trying to see like how could I build this thing in. But it is a challenge right now, because right now I'd have to derive all of those public keys, but then I have to go and check with the Electrum server on every single one to see, well, were any funds actually sent to this, or am I just sort of making this thing up and it's not actually a reality on the blockchain yet? So that it just doesn't work at this stage. And hopefully we get to a point, maybe as you say, we have to download the UTXO set, but the challenge is always going to be the amount of bandwidth that we use and whether we can kind of index that. I do think that silent payments is a beautifully written spec. I think that there is a use case for it for people who really need to be private and who really need to have that non-interactive approach. And there are people like that out there, particularly activists in the world, you know, who can't run a server like a public-facing BTC Pay server, but can run a node. And there's a difference between the two of them. And for that particular use case, I think it hits a really sweet spot because you don't need to worry about the scanning cost. It's all kind of built in anyway. You're doing all of that work. So I do think it works for that. But I struggle to see the broader use case until we get something else. And again, I don't know what that might be, but who knows? You know, it's very hard to predict what the holds. So that's kind of where I'm at with it, not just to you, but to the kind of world. Anyone is asking, that's kind of where I struggle with it right now. Is how do I bring this in a way that maintains the user experience of what Sparrow users expect, which is near instant. All of my transactions appear. You know, that's I think a good point to perhaps jump into something else. I know that you wanted to talk a bit about coin selection, and I think that that's an interesting and general purpose thing that would be quite useful for people to kind of wrap their heads around. So the idea of how does one manage a wallet? How do you understand, and how does the wallet manage what UTXOs are in it? So currently we have these two kind of competing concerns. We have the one economic concern and the privacy concern on the one side. And basically what you have is, if you want to be really private, then you don't want to consolidate the UTXOs that you have in your wallet, right? You don't want to make one big UTXO, because then that links all of those payments and basically links them all together on the blockchain for anyone to see. But from an economic point of view, that is what you want, because you pay for a transaction based on the size of data in the transaction. So the more inputs and the more UTXOs you spend, you're going to be paying more. So how do you, I mean, that's the sort of basic intro, but in terms of how a wallet handles coin selection, how do you balance that? What's your kind of thinking on the right way to think about that particular challenge?
Yeah, I wanted to make one comment in summary of what you said there. I think you mentioned like there's a war for like user adoption, and users are not going to care about certain things, and they're going to go with what works for them. And I very much agree with that, with the caveat that I think everything we do as a developer is a negotiation with the user. And I think how we win that of kind of pushing towards the things that maybe we as developers have a stronger opinion about than the user is always give something to the user, right? Whenever we say like, hey, I'm gonna change your wallet experience, right? And I'll pick a good example, mempool notifications, right? So some people, they open a Bitcoin wallet and they expect to see a notification that someone has sent them money right away. Now, you and I are sitting here and I say, hey, I just sent you some Bitcoin. You don't wanna wait for the next block to come in, for then your wallet to download the BIP158 filter and then check and everything like that. And I can argue with you, be like, no, Craig, that's more private. And you're like, Josie, I just want to know if you sent me the money before we move on. So I do think we have to be, we have to spend a lot of time as developers negotiating with our users and explaining and educating them and explaining like, all right, look, I'm going to take this feature away from you, but I'm going to give you a better feature. And explaining that, and there's an individual I've been working with in the Netherlands, Mo. She's involved with the Bitcoin design community, and Christoph as well. As someone who's mostly spent his time working on backends, I've been learning a lot from them as UX researchers, where they're saying, look, we've got to tell a story and a narrative for the user of why the experience is this way, like. And there's a lot of storytelling we can do with how we communicate information to the user. So I agree with you. You kind of have to like, whatever meets the user's needs, whether it's good or not, on how it's implemented, privacy, et cetera, that's what users are going to use. But I think we have a lot more leeway there of, let's tell a story about this wallet. Let's tell a story about what it's doing for the user. Let's explain to the user what they're getting. And that's where I am kind of more positive about pushing new features and new designs to users, as long as we're explaining to them, like, here's what I'm doing for you, and here's the trade-off compared to something else. And I think we, as Bitcoin gains more adoption and we see more development happening, I think it's where we have to engage those folks more, the UX people, and be like, look, you guys have been doing this for decades. Bitcoin is now 16 years old or whatever. How can we learn from the Facebooks, the Instagrams, the Twitters, like all these other apps that are doing these great user experiences and managing trade-offs? How can we start to learn from that, bring that to Bitcoin? Jumping into the coin selection stuff, I think when we talk about privacy, I think of it in like 3 categories. We have this like application level privacy, which is where the BIP47 and the silent payments fall, which is how do you and I privately exchange information about doing a payment that stays between us. So this communication of addresses, and then we talk about interactive and non-interactive. Then we have the actual transaction itself. And this kind of falls into like, so we have the app layer, maybe the wallet layer now, and how you construct the transaction can reveal a lot of information. So maybe wallet does something funky within lock times, and everybody knows like, oh, this person is using Sparrow, or wallets that use object multisig or like bespoke scripts, people can kind of figure out, okay, they're using this particular wallet, and maybe that's information you don't want people to know. And then coin selection, I think, is really where in Bitcoin the battle is won or lost when it comes to privacy, because whatever you do in that transaction is going to be permanently on chain for as long as Bitcoin exists. So even if there's no threat to your privacy right now, maybe in 10 years there is, and there's this on-chain record. So this is why I think coin selection is one of these topics that maybe doesn't get enough attention. And so we have all these heuristics that chain analysis uses for kind of tracking the flow of UTXOs. And a lot of them are kind of garbage science, but kind of like with the Electrum thing, it doesn't matter what's correct or good, that's what people are going to use. And so when it comes to this privacy thing, like you said, there's this tightrope you have to balance between economic efficiency. I don't want to pay a lot of money on chain to get privacy because now there's this disincentive to be private, right? Or maybe to put it differently, there's this privilege of privacy where like, if you have a lot of money, you can be more private than somebody else. But if I'm very sensitive to fees and like on-chain fees, and like we said earlier, they're going to keep going up, you're going to price users out of privacy. And I think coin joins are a good example of this, and some other techniques where you're doing these remixes and things, and it's like, you can get decent privacy. Looking at one is like changeless transactions. How can we make changeless transactions? And that becomes this interesting like algorithmic problem, right? Like what kind of UTXOs do you need in the wallet? What's kind of the expected amounts that the user is doing such that we could hit like a 99% change? Wrote a thesis on this. And there's some coin selection algorithms in core that try to optimize for changeless. So that's kind of interesting. But it brings back in the problem of efficiency versus privacy, where to do a changeless transaction, I might now have to bring in more UTXOs, right? And so how do we balance that? Because now, like you said, I'm using more UTXOs as inputs, which then kind of says to the world, I own all of these inputs, which is a problem for privacy. And it's also more expensive. Now I have more inputs, the transaction's more expensive, and now the user's like, wow, like, why am I paying so many fees if I could just have like one input, 2 outputs, and change? So I think there's probably some sweet spot there. And then I also think a lot about like, how can we have wallets that are like proactively optimizing and trying to figure out, maybe once every now and then your wallet creates a change output and splits it into 3 UTXOs to prepare for that next when you're going to need a changeless transaction. And this is an area that it doesn't feel like a lot of people have been looking at it, and I feel like there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there where we can hit that sweet spot of let's not reveal too much about the balance of our wallet by consolidating, but let's also not leave breadcrumbs through these change transactions to kind of let people know how our funds are flowing over time. and that's a very interesting one to me. I think another area when we talk about coin selection, and I think this is kind of related to some work you've done in the BIP world with labels, if I'm not mistaken, of like exporting the label. I think labels is like a super critical part of privacy, coin selection, and our on-chain footprints. And the prior recommendation or the prior art has always been label all of your UTXOs, and then you be your own coin selection. Like you kind of go in there and be like, I don't want to mix the UTXO from mom with the UTXO from my drug dealer, and like be very like proactive there. That's not going to work over time, I don't think. I think putting the onus on the user of like, hey, don't mess this up and like take all these extra steps, people are going to get in a hurry, people are going to get lazy. And so if privacy isn't kind of the default behavior, or if we don't have algorithms doing it, users are going to mess it up. So where I'm really interested as kind of like a future research area is how can we have label-aware coin selection? So the wallet is kind of automatically applying labels. And this is an area we spend a lot of time thinking in the silent payments BIP of like, how can we add labels to these addresses that get automatically applied without the user doing anything? So automatic labeling, and then also the user putting in their own manual labels, and then maybe setting, you know, some preferences, or like maybe there's some user flow where they kind of say like, I don't want my UTXOs to be mixed, I want them kind of separate or whatever. There's this initial like onboarding they do, and then the coin selection algorithm takes it from there. And the coin selection can see, you know, these different labels, and it doesn't have to semantically understand them. It can just see these are AAAA, this is BBBB, CCCC, and then the coin selection algorithm tries to work with these label groups and avoid mixing, consolidating UTXOs. And that's another area that's like, it's very easy to talk about in theory. I don't know how practical it is in practice, but it's an area that I want to spend more time researching, and I want other people to start thinking about of like, how can we put less work on the user, where you have to kind of actively curate and manage your UTXO set, and have the wallet be smart and do these labels, and then have coin selection pick up from that. And again, I think that's another area where there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and there's a lot of things that we can kind of take the burden away from the user and put it there. And that's where I am really excited about, I don't remember the BIP number, about like the wallet label export format. 329, BIP 329, that's critical, right? Like we're all really excited about the 12 words, and, you know, I'm personally a fan of the seed phrases at all because it doesn't have script information, it doesn't have label information. Descriptors was kind of a move towards like, all right, how can we actually back up everything that the user would need to fully recover all the script types, and I think it's great. But then also I think BIP 329 is kind of that missing piece of, I need to move, you know, let's say the wallet I'm using gets compromised or the devs don't work on it anymore. Now I need to move to another wallet. How do I keep all of that label information, script information, and how do we create standards around that so this metadata that is super critical for privacy and usability doesn't die with any particular wallet? And so like if I have my phrase and I'm using Sparrow, and Sparrow's got all this great labeling stuff, and I've curated all these labels, and my coin selection algorithm is aware of it, and then I, you know, for whatever reason I mess something up and all I have is my seed phrase, and then I put that in another wallet, and I'm at ground zero now, and it's like, oh, I don't remember what my labels were, and I could then compromise privacy. So I'm mentioning that because it's like, I think it would be premature to jump into all of this like super intelligent coin selection label aware stuff if we don't already have this guarantee that this very critical metadata that we're now going to be using for algorithms and privacy, if we don't have standards around sharing that and exporting that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Just to kind of where I ended up with a lot of these kind of concepts was, you know, number one, make the user label every transaction they send. You can't make them label every transaction they receive because those are just going to happen, of course, but you can make them label mandatory every transaction that you send. So you have some idea if there's change, you've labeled that change. The second point is in your example, I would put your drug dealer funds into a different account. We've got the BIP 32 accounts. I would use accounts. I think they're very helpful. I think they're underused. So I'd really emphasize that people consider accounts and use accounts. It's really a great way to segregate funds in a way that will ensure that they never get mixed, because Sparrow certainly will never mix funds from two different accounts. I am occasionally asked for it, but I try to resist that because I think on balance it's going to be a negative thing. And then finally, in terms of the coin selection part of it, I've kind of said, well, there is no way for a machine to just know what the user would want. It's just too much, at least with the technology that we have today. So what I've done there is I've made it an explicit choice, and you've got a sort of a toggle at the bottom of the transaction, the sort of send tab that allows you to choose whether you have a normal transaction, which is optimized for the most economic way. And I use the work that Merch did. It's basically the same coin selection algorithm in Bitcoin Core is reflected in the Sparrow. So it's trying to consider the total cost of what those UTXOs are over time. So it's kind of building that in. So that's the sort of economic and the normal approach, but you also then have a more private transaction, obviously a more expensive one, and that uses a different coin selection algorithm, but it actually goes all the way and creates this fake two-person coin join, which makes it much more difficult for a chain analysis company to be able to follow the funds through the blockchain. So to be able to say, because now you have two outputs which have the same value, and now you don't know which of those two outputs actually went to the recipient and which just went back into the wallet of the user. So it immediately cuts the probability of following that flow of funds down by half, and that's quite a lot. In the blockchain analysis world, it's always about the probabilities that you have of being able to follow funds through. And if you can say, well, I've got a 90% probability of knowing that funds that started here ended up over here, well, that's pretty good. But if you cut that in half, suddenly you're down to 45, right? And then if you can cut that further, very helpful. So that's kind of the ways in which I see it right now with the technology we have today. Obviously, people are going to keep thinking about it and keep figuring out new ways to kind of go at things. But that's what we've got. Well, that's where I am today. I just want to do a time check because we are.
Yeah, I think we're right out. If I can close with one comment you said about I want to close with a comment you said about like coin selection. And then you also mentioned the index building. Another super important for the broader Bitcoin development community is got to start a ecosystem. And so the coin selection one is a great example. You know, Bitcoin state of the art, you know, coin selection algorithms. And then every developer who then wants to benefit from that, they either have to build a wallet that is based on Bitcoin cores, RPCs, or whatever, which is not great in my opinion, or they have to re-implement the coin selection algorithm. And this is where I'd love to see us start to take these problems like coin selection, put them into libraries that then anyone can use, and you can kind of just import that. And it's well tested, it's got like all the guarantees and review. And I think BDK is kind of leading the charge on this a little bit and trying to be like a wallet SDK. I would love to see more of that happening. I think recently I saw you did the HWI as well, and it's like, let's start to make more of these things accessible to users, language agnostic, you know, so that people don't have to all switch to Rust if they want to benefit from a certain ecosystem. And so coin selection is one. I think, you know, you mentioned earlier the index stuff. I want to see more empowerment for users to build their own indexes for their wallets without having to reinvent the entire wheel. And this is where I think the Bitcoin kernel is very promising, where we can kind of provide users APIs and SDKs for them to solve these problems rather than core becoming the bottleneck or everyone re-implementing things on their own. And that's where I'm hopeful that we'll mature as an ecosystem, because then I think everybody kind of gets good privacy, good engineering, without every individual wallet tackling these problems on their own. I think in the interest of time, we stop there. And it's been a great discussion. It was like, lovely chatting.
Yeah, thank you. That's been great. So thanks, everyone.